Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to a special edition of In the Clouds. I am Chris Short, host of Red Hat Live Streaming, and I am joined by the one and only Wei Lien, Senior Director of Hybrid Platforms, Product and Marketing here at Red Hat. He's also the former co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at StackRox, who was acquired by Red Hat not too long ago. How are you today, Wei?
I'm doing well, Chris. Thanks, and thanks for having me here. It's great to be on.
Hey, it's great having you on. Thanks for saying yes. So I've been looking forward to this one, believe it or not, because I've been a StackRox fan for a while now. Back in KubeCon San Diego, the StackRox folks asked if I could just do like a high-level security talk about the CNCF landscape, basically, right? And like all the tools that are in it. And I really had an appreciation for StackRox because you didn't necessarily like make yourself so hard to replicate. Like you stayed Kubernetes native, right? Like somebody could have done the exact same thing you did potentially in a different way and still use those native components. Or they could have gone a more proprietary route, which I think is part of the reason why we were like, "Ooh, we should acquire StackRox." Kind of, can you tell me, a little bit about yourself, and we'll skip the icebreaker question because you went meta universe on me for that. So let's just dive right in. Introduce yourself and talk to me about StackRox becoming part of Red Hat.
Sure. I mean, so I was a co-founder at StackRox, and today I head up what we've rebranded the product as, which is Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security for Kubernetes, or ACS for short.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, I mean, one of the really key approaches that we took around thinking about how security should be handled in these environments is to go with what we called Kubernetes native. And what we think of as Kube native is about integrating with the existing security capabilities and controls that exist in Kubernetes, allowing users to utilize the same abstractions and constructs and primitives that they're already familiar with, but also extending those capabilities to address use cases across the entire lifecycle. So vulnerability management, configuration management, compliance, threat detection, all those things that give you sort of an end-to-end security platform from build to runtime. And for me, just like kind of how I got into the space for a bit is I've been in and around infrastructure and infrastructure security for the last decade or so. So worked at large companies, focused on cloud infrastructure and virtualization, and then actually joined a company called CoreOS as head of product. And that company was also acquired by Red Hat. So in some sense, like all roads lead to Red Hat.
Okay.
But I think. But I think if you went back like 5 years in the ecosystem, 5-6 years, and Kubernetes was still a little bit more nascent, there was a lot of interest and demand for starting to run cloud native technologies in production and for mission critical use cases, as you know. But there were significant gaps in security capabilities, and so companies like Red Hat and other contributors, started to think about how they could insert and build out things like role-based access control and other related capabilities that would instill more confidence in using Kube and related software in environments where security was a significant consideration.
Right. Yeah, and it's one of those things. Like I used to work in very restricted environments, and it was one of those things. If you didn't stick it, you weren't putting it on the network. So like there was this process of all offline until it went onto a network that was disconnected from the internet. So it's like, well, wait a minute. Like why do we have to worry about the internal stuff so bad? But yes, you can't let there's all kinds of security breaches that have happened because of either bad user education or bad controls. And StackRox and ACS bring a lot to the table in that regard, I feel like.
For sure. I mean, to be fair, I mean, like security is complex, and if you look at like so many layers of the stack, so so many parts of the life cycle. Like it,
Right.
something can easily go missed, or go wrong or unexpectedly.
Hmm.
And I know you want to talk about this, but this is where I think like getting more people into the mix, more eyes on a
Yeah.
particular topic can really help. But for us, I think the whole decision to go around Kube Native was to try to align with how the cloud native community was thinking about it, how
Hmm.
the ecosystem around CNCF and so on, how they wanted to kind of approach, being open, in terms of solving, key security problems that have existed. So, for us, Kube Native is also about, aligning, with the overall direction of, how the extended, Kubernetes community and cloud native community is thinking about security.
Right. And and you mentioned security being hard. I mean, nowadays it's harder than ever. It feels like, if you have watched the headlines from 2021, it's either been coronavirus or ransomware, right? So it's one or the other, right? And we've got an executive order to talk about all manners of securities and safeties that are going to be put in place or should be put in place. But now we have NIST standards, we have a hardening guide from the NSA, we have the CIS benchmark, we have guidance to make the entire pipeline solid. Where does ACS fit in the pipeline, and where do you think people benefit the most from its capabilities?
Sure, and to your point about cybersecurity being top of mind, I mean, I was just reading this morning about how like the president's meeting with CEOs of a bunch of tech companies, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to figure out sort of these pressing issues around cybersecurity that make it a more open dialogue, I think,
Right.
across the industry. But I think when it comes to sort of industry standards, I think one of the great things is that people have started to coalesce around this sort of set of best practices, when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to securing containers and Kubernetes and things like that. And you mentioned some of the organizations that have been publishing guidelines. And I do think if you kind of look at or read through those in detail, and I mean they they can make your eyes water a bit. I mean,
Oh
they
yeah.
get pretty they get pretty,
Oh yeah.
they get really they get really detailed. But I think if you kind of take a step back, I mean, there is a lot of overlap, between them. And I think what that signals is that there is, somewhat broad recognition or fairly broad recognition that, there's a set of, common methodologies or, controls or things people should really think about getting started with. And now, look, there's a lot. Like if you look at, say, the CIS benchmarks, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's like hundreds of checks or something like that, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so I think how ACS fits in is in two ways, which is, and I think it fits in with how someone might approach tackling these things. Like one is like you can't try to get, hundreds of things out of the box yourself. And
Right.
so,
No, not
so
possible.
I think one is like think about where you start. And I think, the starting point for nearly every organization or end user is typically like with build, like
Mm-hmm.
as you're building images, container images, like how do you think about securing them, how do you prevent vulnerable software from entering your environment. Those are like just like the low hanging fruit, I think that exists for people to start with. And then how ACS enables that is we give you a more turnkey experience in terms of automating those checks and providing those by default out the box. Like our whole philosophy is like we want to make these environments secure by default,
Right.
and that's not to say that it takes away your choice of how
Right.
you might want to customize or meet like specific needs of you know your applications or your environments or your organization, no policies, but we want to give you like a reference point to start with. Otherwise, like I said, it's like you start with these manuals effectively and you're just like how do I actually go
Yeah.
about this? It's impractical in most cases.
Right. Yeah. And so this kind of brings us to the intersection of automation, which to me means DevOps, and security, which means DevSecOps. and containers, and kind of like the two intercept pretty hard and fast nowadays. But where can people find actionable places to start injecting in their pipeline, right? Like not just at container build time, right? But like making that repeatable is also very important too, right?
Sure. And I'd be curious for your perspective. I mean, I think for me, like, sometimes I think about this in terms of like there's the abstract, and then there's a very practical. Like, I think, conceptually, like there's so much, that in terms of how containers and DevSecOps can complement each other. In the sense that, like, okay, it's like developers and DevOps teams are the ones who are, really driving the usage of containerization. And, with DevSecOps, you want to shift left and have, those individuals, start to think about security early in the life cycle anyways. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's like the properties of containers. It's like, they're meant to be declarative. You
Right.
can kind of specify and scope down what, a given container is supposed to do. And that also helps security, right?
Mm-hmm.
And makes it easier for, people who are, more targeted in terms of how they're operating, for a given application to actually, understand what security controls need to be, assigned to a particular, or applied to a particular application. I
Right.
think practically, like, where, it makes sense to sort of start with injecting security controls is, as you're building, I would even say even before you're building images.
Mm-hmm.
I like talk to people and I'm like, hey, think about like what registry you're going to allow,
Yeah.
image pulls
Inbounds.
from,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
make sure it's like a trusted registry, like either your own or like from a reputable vendor. I mean, and look,
Right.
even public, image repositories from, large vendors still have backdoored images on them.
Right.
Like you read
Yeah.
these things.
You hear about it kind of on and off throughout the year. It's like, oh, well, if that little Node.js package had something, then that means this container everywhere had something. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and
like it's
I,
scary out there, right?
well, it's like everyone's going after, crypto jacking and cryptocurrency mining, Chris. I
For
mean, like you
now.
hear about for now, yeah. I mean, you hear about these like large scale campaigns, that like,
Yeah.
Microsoft and others publish about. So, but anyways, like, I would say, like, where can you start? It's like, when you hook up a registry, when you maybe
Mm-hmm.
decide to set up a private registry. It's also, um, for your base images.
Yeah.
It's like even before you build, it's like for your base
Right.
images, like,
What
is
are
it
you
from a
choosing
reputable?
there? Yeah.
Yeah, is it from someone like Red Hat, who's a,
Mm-hmm.
trusted, reputable vendor? Like, do you have the source code for that base image? Like, all those things. So I think, like there are definitely ways to build in good security, approaches and hygiene, like even before you start building. And then once you start building, I think, hooking into, and taking advantage of automation via, integrating with the CI/CD pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
often makes sense. And so that could be doing configuration checks. It could be, scanning for vulnerabilities. We put out, about a year ago, actually nearly a year ago, this like open source tool called Kubernetes, which is
Oh
like,
yeah. I love that tool.
yeah, it's like, developers are like working with their Helm charts and YAML files, and, maybe they misconfigured something. So we'll
Right.
help
It
run a
happens.
check on it. It happens for sure. Like, you're busy, you're like, you're doing a bunch of things, and, maybe you miss this configuration. Like, and so that's how ACS, or, Stack, sort of, our open source project, Kubernetes, or, whatever
Mm-hmm.
else in terms of how we support, um, across our product portfolio. That's how, we can, help end users kind of avoid some of these problems.
Yeah, and I'll just read the about real quick for Kubelinter. Kubelinter is a static analysis tool that checks Kubernetes YAML files and Helm charts to ensure the applications represented in them adhere to best practices. So there's some best practices baked into this tool, scans the files that you're trying to load into Kubernetes, and you can then, double check that what you're doing is actually good or going to open up some backdoor that you're not aware of. Like the amount of automation that I think you can insert for containers nowadays is vast, right? And Kubelinter is just like, just make sure your stuff's good and put it in the repo type thing for me, right? Like constantly check those files for new rules, because I mean, you just had a release yesterday of Kubelinter, so it's good stuff. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Oh, what I mean, what are your thoughts, Chris? Like, I mean, you talk to a bunch of folks in the
Mhm.
ecosystem and industry. Like, how are they thinking about like DevSecOps and containers, like furthering each other? Just curious to get your perspective.
I mean, right now it feels like the hardest thing for a lot of folks to do is to get security out of its mindset of here's your checklist, go, right? Like, no, I would like you to be part of the process of getting this code to production, right? Like there's tooling you use, then please inject it into the pipeline. So getting security to just come talk to you and share tooling has been a problem in my past for sure. And I still think some developers are having that issue, and DevOps folks alike are having that issue these days, especially given that a lot of the regulatory stuff is met by policy internally. So a lot of time is being spent writing policies to meet certain new thresholds or certain new guidelines. And it's not necessarily a holistic um, process now. It's very much siloed still, and that security team needs to be pulled in big time.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't go. You're saying that people largely treat it as some sort of checklist. I think it's
Yeah.
not necessarily surprising. I mean, I think many security teams today are overburdened and overwhelmed just in terms of priorities and sheer number of tools that they have
Yeah.
to work with.
Right.
I mean, yeah, and so even 5-6 years ago, like when container security was starting to become a thing, like people were like, oh, but it's like down here on my list. But
Mm-hmm.
increasingly, like it's now bubbling up to one of the top priorities, just because I think of like the tremendous adoption of kube and cloud native workloads.
Yeah. And if my container file means so much, and if my Kubernetes artifacts mean so much, then they need to be checked for everything, just like my code is, right? Like, but we have to put in Kubernetes tooling to do that, it feels like. And some of that tooling can easily be plugged in, and some of it is harder to plug in than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
we've gone through a couple generations of digital transformation, as people call it these days. um like there's still the legacy tooling that folks have to have. There's some newer stuff, and then there's some cloud native stuff, and like making that pipeline the same for everybody is hard. um so that, I mean, having the pipeline first is step one, I feel like, and then plugging everyone and everybody into it is step two. If I mean, if I could change a developer's mind about how important their security team is during this conversation, I think that'd be great. um because if not, right, like you can't possibly know everything about anything, right? Like
Sure, sure.
unless your subject matter is very small, you're not going to be able to understand the underpinnings of Kubernetes and like this etcd vulnerability that just got 0-dayed by somebody. Like you're not going to get feedback on that if you don't know about it. So continuous
Yeah,
education is a part of it too, but so like your tools need to be continually educated as well. I'm kind of curious, with Kubelinter and with advanced container security for Kubernetes, like how are those rules added? Where do we source things from? And no, there was not an actual etcd 0-day. I was just using that as an example. I'm sorry to scare people, my bad, chat. uh, no, there was not an etcd 0-day. I was just using that as an example, right? Like you might find out about it just in time to save your systems, or you might not. Like you've got to have automated security, right? And that's my biggest push, right? Like plugging the people in, getting things automated, and constantly scanning and remediating things. So that's why the GitOps Guide to the Galaxy is up next after this call or show. So yeah, right. Like thinking in that kind of GitOps philosophy. Sorry. I did scare people. Looking at it from like a real time threat detection perspective, where does ACS source its rules from? How do we, how does ACS do that real time detection? What kinds of things are in place to make that happen?
Sure. So, I mean, a couple things on just what you said too. I mean, like, introduce a new platform that's as complex as, Kubernetes. Like, you're gonna introduce things like new vulnerabilities, and like, the your CD thing aside. I mean, like there have been like, critical or important, new vulnerabilities in Kubernetes that have been discovered and disclosed and managed by the community and all of that. But I think like part of the answer, aside from automation, is like delivering some of these capabilities, via the platform.
Right.
And so take OpenShift as an example, because of course, we're Red Hat, but it's just like, and even before ACS,
right.
It's like you could deliver a secure platform and you could surface those things, or you could, better protect, organizations from some of these things by baking in the security capabilities into the platform, from the beginning. And then, how we think about it is like layering ACS, on top. And so, among other areas, one is like, threat detection and sort of asking about that. And I think for us, I'll talk about, threat detection and policies, but like we've built, our platform to, be extensible and accommodate for, scenarios where new things are going to arise.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and in some cases, like, it's going to be specific to, a particular environment. And so, where we started is, we wanted to gain sort of like a source of truth, for the data that underpins like threat detection.
Right.
And I think there's other folks in the ecosystem have thought about it similarly, but I think that it's a relatively newer approach, and it's enabled by containers because, it's less noisy. Like containers doing a specific thing, you have a better idea of what you're going to do. And so when you look at things like system level data, like, system calls and, network traffic and things like that, you have a very specific idea of like what a container or microservice or whatever is supposed to do. You can even correlate that back to like what, the manifest or image, specified.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can look at things like, what process executed, like what network request was made, like all of that. And like that all helps like inform like better and better, threat detection.
Right.
And then in terms of like kind of, both detection and policies, I mean, like, this is where I think a community can really, really help, because, more people can contribute and surface and identify issues that just much harder for, any single organization, to be able to do. And so, this is where like if a new kube vulnerability is surfaced, then we'll add that. If there's a new sort of best practice that's articulated by a SIG or other member of the community, we'll look at that and add that. And so, and we look to do that, because we're in close collaboration with folks, but at the same time, like we want to release that to our our user base as quickly as possible. But I do think like sort of the openness and community approach has a big hand in facilitating and enabling sort of like being more responsive and proactively identifying issues that I think individual vendors by themselves would have a harder time doing.
Right. Okay, so you're a, let's see, let me read your title again. Never mind. You're
too long.
It's too long. You're a senior director type, and this question just came in via chat, and I kind of want your take on it before I respond. Russia is using Kubernetes clusters for brute force attacks. Does CNCF and or Red Hat and I would assume Google, have methods of preventing Kubernetes and OpenShift to be used for malicious intent.
Well, I think that's probably beyond the scope of simply what I can answer, but
Right.
what I
Likewise.
mean, what I would say is I think Red Hat has been very straightforward in terms of an entitlement model that lets customer lets end users utilize its software, and part of that is complying with certain terms and conditions. And so I'm going to defer kind of on some
Mhm.
kind of definitive answer to that, but to me it seems like very plausible, or that it falls outside that scope. But I mean, we definitely have a very open and straightforward model in terms of how we want what we allow our how we allow our software to and not to be used.
Right. Like at Red Hat, yes, we do have minimal control of licensing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be running, right? Like it's just invalid, right? You're
Yeah.
not going to
So
get support for it. I mean, we can't put backdoors in software, folks. We can't. It's not, in my opinion, a wise decision. Now, somebody can differ from me in that opinion, and that's fine. That's your opinion. But no, we do not have a way of having some, kill switch. And I read an article yesterday about Samsung having something in their TVs. If they're stolen, they can make them inoperable. And like that to me, right? Like I'm like, I don't like that,
so is
because
it too
the
too
risk
too
of the risk
too
of that
big bro
being
too big brother for you, Chris?
a little too big brothery. But the chances of that being, now that it's out in the known that it's there, the chances of that being exploited are now infinitely higher, right? Because now people are going to go looking for the kill switch and start scanning the internet for Samsung TVs and start poking it and see what they can do with it, right? Like I would not be surprised if there's a Metasploit module for Samsung TVs kill switch here in the next couple of months. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like the idea of kind of vendors being able to like come in and say, nope, you can turn that off now, because all kinds of things can go wrong in your infrastructure. There always is a human element to it, right? No matter what. So having that backdoor, or having some process where it's like, oh, I need to log in and do this one thing perfectly every time during your release, is destined to be a point of failure of some sort. Either
Yeah.
you mess up a flag, or you find some other foul up in your process and your release goes bad.
Well, this is where I tend to think. I mean, like, timing and transparency are not inconsistent with each other. I mean,
Mm-mm,
like, think about vulns and exploits so
mm-hmm,
you understand the threat vector. I mean, there's a reason why, like, those need to be embargoed sometimes,
right.
but the intent is, you work with, whoever there, like, relevant stakeholders to come up with a solution, and then you be thoughtful about how you disclose it,
Right.
and at least for Red Hat and the broader Kube community with like their product security committee and things like that. I mean, I think people have been very thoughtful about how they've approached new issues, at least in in this software platform. But yeah, I mean, going back to how things are used, you know, I think there's an aspect of openness, but I also think, like, Red Hat's been thoughtful about how we try to historically made software available for use, and which uses and things like that.
um yeah, so if yeah, here's a good question for you, just came off my head. If you were about to sit down with some new hire at XYZ company and they were on the security team, what would be some of the things you would talk to them about as a fresh infosec person, right? Like, what would
Sure.
be some of your top talking points there?
Well, it's interesting because I think the first thing that stands out is you kind of said, like, infosec, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like, with new hires, everyone, I think largely wants to understand kind of like what's the vision? Like, what are we trying to, the bigger thing we're trying to do here, aside from, the next feature or like the next sprint or whatever it might be. And I think, the vision is really to change how security is operationalized. Like,
Mhm.
the fact that someone may think of it as infosec, I think reflects something, because I
Mhm.
think in these environments you can't be thinking of it as some kind of silo, and it's not
Right.
really just infosec. It's, we talked about DevSecOps, but it's really sort of like organizationally you need like a culture, and you need to build that muscle of like, how you think about security differently. And so that's actually what I would probably spend, most of my time talking about, which is just like, you know, for containers, for kube, for cloud
Mhm.
native stuff, like, microservices, like, what does security look like? Like, how is it, actually different? And what's the opportunity there to actually build better security? You know,
Right.
and then again, there's like, you can talk about it like conceptually, but I think, we're really making that happen via, an actual platform that, you know, many organizations are running today.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, new hires that, they kind of get like the bigger picture, and they want to, get a sense for, or it's like, hey, like, what do you think about this project? Like, there's this, latest open source project. Like, what are your thoughts? Do you think we'd integrate with it? Like, do you think we could, build on that? Like, how would we fit in? And I mean, I think that's great. Like, the fact that, you could look at the ecosystem today and point to so many different security related projects that address, many different problems, I think is a testament to like how the community has like innovated in that area, in it, in a space that has historically, as you have pointed out, like typically not been very open.
Right. Yeah. And, some people think closed source tools are better because, well, they're closed and you can't see the code. Other people think open source tools are better because you can see everything in the open. Um, why would someone rather work with an open source project in Europe versus something closed source?
Well,
Keeping
it's
in
more
mind
more
that ACS is kind of going through that same process, right?
yeah. I mean, and I think that that's allowed us to kind of like look at it from both lenses. I mean, I think that, my personal opinion is that, openness, fosters more confidence, like, and ultimately more, innovation and a better security posture. Like, you have diversity of voices and thoughts and perspectives. You have more eyes on something. You can, surface or think through, a security issue, more holistically, more comprehensively.
Mhm.
um, you can think about how you, go forward and build, in a way that, can benefit many organizations. And then third is like just practicality, is like, more stable code, like, faster response time, like, just because, you're not reliant on, a particular set of individuals. So I think it's this notion that like by being open, you can actually do more.
Right.
Um, I've also worked on my share of like closed source projects. And I think
Mhm.
where that comes in is just like, look, I mean, sometimes I mean, most cases, to actually like, put out these open source projects, like you need a sustainable business. Like, you need to be a going concern, right? And so,
Right.
that's where I think, closed source, is definitely relevant and can make sense. But I think the key question is more like what is closed and what is open, in
Right.
those scenarios. And it's beyond kind of the subject of like this show, but it's kind of like,
Right.
yeah, if you're building a business on top of open source, you're kind of like, what needs to be open, what should be open, what doesn't have to be, and how do you build a business around it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the hard part, right? Like building a business around an open source project is indeed difficult. Red Hat has shown success with that, but it's one of the few potentially.
For sure.
I mean, there are
To-
some others, don't get me wrong, but you know, Red Hat forged the way, I guess. I mean, potentially. Not trying to sound too bold here, but I mean, you mentioned that transparency does make a difference, right? So being transparent here, what gets you up in the morning? What's something that's you enjoy and look forward to in your day here at Red Hat?
Well,
or
I
just
mean,
in the
first,
community in general, right?
well,
Yeah.
on that, that's easy. I mean, yeah, my kids get me up every morning. Like they
Hmm.
pull me out. They literally pull me out of bed sometimes. So
I didn't mean physically necessarily, but yeah, that works, I guess.
no, I mean, you know, we didn't talk too much about the acquisition, but I mean, like, I'm thrilled about kind of like what we're doing here,
Hmm.
with Red Hat because I think the way forward for security for all things cloud native is this comprehensive like platform that gives someone an out of the box secure experience. Like I just it's just too much and too complex to figure out by oneself. And so I think you need a trusted platform and vendor like supporting you in kind of wherever you are in that journey to accomplishing stuff with cloud native software. And to me I think that that's a mission that I find very impactful and something that excites me. And in some ways I think like the vision for our team has not changed with the acquisition. I think we've been able to do more by teaming
Right.
up and joining forces with Red Hat. And so that's kind of how I thought about it. But I think we're still in the early innings of this sort of like huge shift, paradigm shift in terms of how security is handled. And I think
Hmm.
it's really like it was like the catalyst was kube and containers and sort of all these like technical innovations. But I think like the what's really going to be felt over the years to come is kind of like you know more time freed up, better security productivity, like all that stuff that's very, very hard to, kind of it's not as concrete as like,
Right.
some kind of like technical advancement or something like that.
Hmm. So, what are you excited about? Well, let me ask that question later. Um, what should we be thinking about for the future, right? Like we are in this cloud native space, we are consuming cloud services left and right. Some are SaaS based, some are actually like from big hyperscalers. What does the future of security look like to you,
Yeah, I
especially in
mean,
Kubernetes?
I think kube security ultimately is not really about kube.
Right.
And the reason I say that is like, I mean, other people have said this, so I'm co-opting it, and I'm not
Hmm.
claiming it as my own. But I think people have said like kube is a platform upon which platforms will be built. And you
Hmm.
started to see that, right? Like you started to see that with like service mesh, Istio, and like these
Right.
dependencies, in kube, custom resources and everything like that. And
Hmm.
so, I think the way people like actually consume, compute and sort of like the abstractions that they run like their apps on are going to be built on kube, but like kube's going to be kind of like you know lower in the stack, kind of maybe hidden away or abstracted away and things like that. And so in my mind, I think of things moving in the direction to be higher and higher level. And I think there's a sort of like notion of security as code, which is like a very general thing. But to me, like what that means is like it's simply aligning with like that movement in terms of abstractions. It's almost like it's like if you could think of like serverless as like an operational model where like you don't have to worry about all this stuff. Like there's some kind of like analogous term, maybe we should think about what that is. But like there's some kind of analogous term where it's just like security is also going to be abstracted. It's like it's going to be codified. It's not.
Security-less.
There you go.
That wouldn't
Yeah.
terrify anybody. Um, sorry, that just popped out. Please continue.
No,
Might not
I
be
mean,
able to. Who knows?
I just think that it's something where like it's not going to be if you've integrated it correctly into the platform, day-to-day focus is not going to be on like tuning some kind of kernel level component or something like
Hmm.
that, right? Like you're going to want to the user's going to want to specify a policy or some kind of artifact that captures security in codified form and have that applied everywhere. So it becomes like a security abstraction that
Right.
people will interface with.
So it's funny you started off that the whole statement of, you know, what's next in the future. It's like Kubernetes gets lower in the stack, we build on top of it, that kind of thing. And Dr. Richard I. Cook, he's known throughout the DevOps community, DevSecOps community, you know, and as well as he's an anesthesiologist. He's also an incident response person. He's kind of like this magician of things, but he has this concept of above the line and below the line, and the below the line stuff is where Kubernetes is going to live at some point. Somebody still has to understand that and then build on top of that. But if we can like Kubernetes gives us a capability of automation that we haven't had before. When you think of it being below the line now, how do you see us getting there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are others out there who have, when I think about like below line, you know, above the line, especially for security, like, you know, people espouse like shared responsibility and like stuff like that. And like,
Right.
I think, and it's like there's delineation, which is like infrastructure and applications. But I think the thing is like that's getting blurred. Yeah, it's getting fuzzy. Like I think, you know, how things evolve over time is, you know, you end up starting to encompass more and more about, you know, applications. And the reason is because like the pieces, you know, that you're using to run your application, like let's say in a serverless environment, like are smaller and smaller. And so, you know, I think that, you know, you start to, you know, take on, you know, more and more of that, and the line almost kind of, which was sort of like somewhat of an artificial line, like ends up going away in my mind.
Good point. Very good point. It does eventually end up going away. Or automated away, right? Like,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
We don't have init scripts anymore. We have systemd. There's some automation there. Say what you want about systemd. I don't care. It's part of the operating system now. But like, you know, that's an abstraction, and we're not worried so much about stuff below that anymore. We're worried about systemd. There's going to be more abstractions like that with Kubernetes, I think, in the future, right? And you know, of all the development platforms that people have tried to build over the years, I think Kubernetes gives us the most stable foundation we've had yet to do such things. So I'm excited about the future. What are you excited about? Either next month, next quarter, next year? What are you most excited about, Wei? I'm genuinely curious.
Well, you know, I mean, if you're gonna point to kind of like, you know, next couple of months, look, I'm super excited about KubeCon.
Right.
You know, KubeCon, and we'll be at Cloud Native Security Day too. But you know, just chance to congregate again, and it's kind of this like hybrid event. But it's really great to see, you know, people being able to like reconvene in person after, you know. I think that's so important too for the community. And look, I mean, like we have a globally distributed community, and I think one of the great things about being open is like you can connect like wherever you know, regardless of wherever you are. But I do think there's something, you know, special about, you know, catching up in, you know, in person with, you know, folks, you know, who, you know, have been, who you've built relationships with, you know, online, offline, and being able to do that in person, especially after, you know, last year and a half we've had.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited about that, you know, meeting folks in LA and, you know, seeing familiar faces, and again, like, you know, talking about where we go with security from here.
Right. And it's been so long since we've sat down and had like that conversation. We might all have very, very new stories to tell and share, and different perspectives too, compared to the last time we all sat down and talked. So I am also looking forward to KubeCon as well. Is there anything else you feel like, do you want to talk about cheesecake or not? I mean, we can, you know, normally it's our icebreaker question, folks. So like we ask, you know, cake or pie? Is cheesecake a cake or a pie? Wei's answer is very, very, you know, interesting, I think, but feel free to talk about anything else that you want to bring up.
Well, I mean, you know, since this is going to be recorded, Chris, I feel like I should get my response like just on the record.
Just on record. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, first, you know, cake or pie. I mean, it's some, you know, someone with a sweet tooth asked, like, you know, like why not both? Like, why the question? But yeah, I mean, so I'll leave it there. But on the cheesecake or pie thing, like I'm going with Alton Brown. Like it's definitely a pie.
Yeah. Okay. Fair
Like
enough.
I just say it like definitively like that.
Okay. Drop the mic, walk off. Cheesecake is pie. And in my opinion, I'm kind of with you, right? Like, doesn't matter. No, not really. I'm going to eat it regardless. But yeah, it's, it's a thing. So, Wei, it's been great talking to you. Is there anything you wanted to mention about the roadmap for ACS or anything coming in the future product wise?
Yeah, I
I can't
mean,
think of anything off the top of my head. So, yeah.
well, I mean, I will, I actually, since you give me the opportunity, I will take just a couple minutes because I think
Sure.
like, since the acquisition, a lot of people have asked like, where are you going? Like, how's the roadmap changed? How are you continuing to innovate? And so, a couple things I'll point to, like just on things we've been delivering since the acquisition happened, which was in February. We have blogs and resources available about this, but I think like it's been great to see us put out certain capabilities that allow us to tie more into the OpenShift portfolio.
Right.
We have a ACS operator, we have vulnerability scanning certification for ACS now, integrations with parts of OpenShift, so things like compliance operator integration and things like that that will give you more seamless and consistent experience across OpenShift and ACS. And of course, that also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that ties into OpenShift Platform Plus, which is, it's a new bundled offering that ACS is a part of. From a roadmap perspective, I think there's many things to highlight. I think one area I just want to call out as an area that we'll continue to build into is managed services. So
Yeah.
Azure OpenShift, Red Hat OpenShift on AWS, Rosa, OpenShift dedicated, all those models. Like I think you asked about like what does security look like in like Kube environments and like the hybrid cloud. I mean, getting the consistent security, whether you're on something like OpenShift and Rosa, Arrow, or whatever else, is really important to us. And so that's going to be a continued area where how people consume ACS is going to become easier and easier over time, regardless of whatever environment they're on. But we are on Operator Hub, so you can take our operator and use us today, and would love to hear your feedback.
Exactly. All right. Wei, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in that tuned in live. Thank you for watching this after the fact if you're watching it later. It was great talking to you today, Wei. Don't be a stranger. We'll meet up at KubeCon, maybe have another conversation. How about that?
Likewise. It was great being on, Chris. Thanks so much again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.